Welcome to episode 2.5, our origin stories. Should put some reverb on origin stories because it's super epic.
Yeah, I'll get right on that.
Yeah. Who are we? How did we get here? What business do we have telling people how to communicate with liberals? Questions that deserve answers. And we're here to do them in this bonus episode.
Bonus content. Yeah, so we wanted to do a little bit of content outside of just the more formal episodes in the miniseries. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with interviewing each other, and then we're going to get into some interviews with other relevant voices and experts in the field. I'm Sarah Cade.
I'm John Houtman. For the past, just about a decade, I've been running Filster Holsters, where we make a whole bunch of concealed carry equipment.
So you work for the gun lobby?
Oh, yeah. Me and my literal, thousandaire buddies out there.
You could make tens of dollars working for the gun lobby.
You could make tens of dollars making holsters. It's such a scam. Yeah, I got into guns, maybe 10, 12 years ago, around then. I had come from a liberal background. My folks were liberal. We lived right downtown in Philadelphia, and it wasn't really the kind of environment where people like me had a gun. I was never exposed to them growing up. It wasn't something we did. It was something that other people did. We're not gun people. Guns were a kind of taboo in the household. No one was really into them. That was something for Republicans and conservatives. And we didn't do that. That wasn't for us.
I didn't grow up with guns in my house either. And my family wasn't like anti-gun. And my family really wasn't like political at all, at least not in my memory when kids were around. We really didn't talk about like liberal or conservative values directly. And there wasn't like a lot of discussion on about what team we were on or, what we were supposed to think or who we were supposed to identify with. So what made you convince me to start this podcast? Because this was not my idea.
Well, I wanted to start this podcast because we would have so many conversations like this, where we would have an experience where we would either observe someone trying to make a compelling argument to someone across the aisle and failing, and looking at it and going, and drawing the football play on it,
right?
In Monday morning quarterbacking their failure to convince someone of something, or hear something and think that's just never gonna. That's never going to convince anybody. I think we listened to someone give a talk about like how to make better arguments, and it was just like, recite the Second Amendment to them. They'll get it. And it's like,
yeah,
no. And we would have so many of these like conversations after the fact, and I'm like, why aren't we recording these and sharing them with people?
Yeah, I had similar experiences there too. I've kind of always felt like between two worlds a little bit.
Definitely.
And that comes a little bit from my background. It comes definitely from the nerdiness. It also is a little bit tied to racial identity as well. As a biracial person, I kind of was a little bit between worlds there, and I never quite fit in either one. And I always kind of observed how each one antagonized the other without realizing it. And sure enough, I got into guns and found myself again in between two worlds. A predominantly conservative majority in guns, and me, a liberal, thinking, oh my God, here we go again. And I have to say, the gun community was incredibly welcoming. The thing that I noticed was really similar with a lot of the racial conversations, though, is we accidentally antagonize each other all the time. And I'm kind of watching that as somebody between both worlds and seeing, okay, here's where you went wrong. Here's where you went wrong. How do we do this better?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing when you cross over, because you're in a position to know firsthand that guns are not at all what liberals have been telling you this whole time. And conversely, you also know that liberals aren't what conservatives think they are.
Yes.
And it's interesting to be in a position where people who have very little or very limited experience with the opposition or the other subject are telling you what it is when you know that both of them are wrong.
Yeah.
So what do you do when you're in that position? Like, do you just, sometimes you feel like your head's going to explode.
Yeah. Been there, done that.
It's like you become familiar with all the conservative arguments in support of gun rights. And you're like, wow, that sounds really familiar. Those sound exactly like all the arguments I've heard for all these other rights. that I've heard in the liberal context.
Right.
How are they missing each other on this?
That is like the $1 million question right there.
I think it has to do with values and group identity.
Yep. And framing. Yep, as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those are all things that we are going to address as we move along in this podcast. What business do we even have with a podcast?
Well, I think that being in that reluctant translator position of like, I have come from the other side and I have something to share with both of you about where you're talking past each other. I think we're kind of obligated, since we've both been in the gun world long enough, that we can speak that language natively. And I feel like I've come to a point where I've gone in big roundabout circles in my political ideology. I've gone from liberal to being surrounded by conservatives and going through that orbit in a way where you've got a liberal distrust of power and authority, and then you wind up in the conservative distrust of power and authority, and you're like, oh, power is so much worse than I thought it was. And you spend some time being a libertarian and an anarchist, and you learn all the conservative points of view, and then you kind of like come out of that a little bit different. So I'm kind of like back to the center at this point, but I feel like I can honestly, fairly, charitably, and genuinely represent both liberal and conservative positions on things with some genuine understanding about them in a way that allows them to actually understand each other.
We're going to try and do as fair a job of that as possible. We are not unbiased, and we definitely have an opinion.
I'm sure someone's going to flame us for something, and we're not going to pass someone's liberal purity test, and we're not going to pass someone's conservative purity test. But we both care passionately and uncompromisingly about the Second Amendment, as well as all of our other rights. And while we may catch some hell for communicating that differently, I think people should know off the bat where we stand on that.
Yep, I think that's fair.
So how'd you wind up getting interested in guns?
So I went from gun agnostic to like full-on Second Amendment absolutist within just a couple of years. And it kind of all started when my mom and I went to go take a gun class together because we were like looking for something to do. And we're like, hey, my mom's all about, she's not materialistic. She's all about having experiences. We were kind of looking for a family bonding activity. And we were like, hey, we have the right to shoot a gun. Like, we're Americans and we were born with that, right? America. And then we just thought, if we can, why don't we just try it? Let's just see what it's like. I think I had maybe gone shooting like one time with a friend. It was when I was younger, and it didn't super affect my political view at that point. We took that class, and that kind of just launched us into the whole gun culture. So, John, what interested you about guns?
I was always kind of interested in guns in kind of like a gadgety way. So it starts off with little boys turn everything into guns, and you play with toy guns. And as hard as my folks in their kind of post-60s minds tried to steer me towards pacifism,
it didn't stick.
Some parents take dolls away from their little boys, but my parents tried to take the guns away from me because they wanted me to grow up to be a pacifist.
Do you think guns being a little bit taboo had anything to do with your fascination with it?
Well, it absolutely did. I'll get to that in a minute, but them being taboo is definitely what made me want to go and do it. I'm like, well, it's transgressive. The liberalism that I grew up with, I think some people have taken to calling it classical liberalism at this point. But like, to me, liberal meant if I'm not hurting anyone and I'm being responsible, it's nobody's business but mine. Like that kind of like, if you don't like it, change the channel, because like free speech and free expression are the most important things. Heroes to me were like Larry Flint and Frank Zappa and Howard Stern and George Carlin and Two Live Crew and controversial artists like Robert Mapplethorpe, who like fought the conservative establishment and censorship for First Amendment rights. So there's some part of it that's like you're supposed to be transgressive in order to keep the man in check and to always kind of like stake out that First Amendment boundary. But then there's all the other stuff like drug legalization and pro-gay marriage and anti-censorship and separation of church and state and equal opportunity and equal protection under the law and kind of like anti-corporate power over government and all of that sort of thing, like mixed into the liberal values. So some of it's liberal, some of it's kind of hippie shit turned into punk rock eventually.
Yeah.
then as the internet emerged, once I started to become kind of like a teenager, there was that kind of like open source movement where like, yeah, like there's no such thing as censorship anymore. Open source gives a lot of democratic power to people. So like that's where a lot of my liberal values came from. And a lot of that like question authority, I internalized from what I thought were liberal values. So when people tell you guns are bad or you shouldn't be dealing with them, I'm like, it's time to question authority. Let's go find out about that, right?
Yeah, I grew up with a lot of that too. And I'm not sure if it came from my family or if I created it myself. I don't really know. Maybe some of it had to do with being a super huge and awkward nerd. I
don't know anything about that.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't have the faintest clue like what that's like.
That wasn't only the first 30 years of my life.
Same. But I think that really influenced my view on what's powerful and what's popular. That was kind of the root of a lot of my transgressive tendencies personally. So what was your first shooting experience like?
My first shooting experience was when I had just turned 21. 21 is when you can have a pistol, or when the ranges in our area would let you come in and rent a pistol without any kind of supervision. And a buddy of mine who was going through the same sort of thing, like you come from the circumstance where everyone tells you, oh, certain things are bad and dangerous, and you find out for yourself that they're not all that bad and dangerous. And this was on the checklist of things to try. So we went to the gun range and we found one near us. Urban gun ranges can be hit or miss. So where I lived in Philly for a long time, there were like 3 gun ranges within like walking distance of my house, which is weird for a big city. 2 of them were like dives that had been there since like the 60s or 70s. And they were like, the vibe in those places was somewhere between like an automotive, like an old automotive garage and like a smut shop. Because like, it's like they had the same fluorescent bulbs that they had in there for 30 years, and the cigar and cigarette smoke was still stuck to the ceiling, and the place, like, it was the kind of place that you could tell had only ever had men in it.
Yep.
There
was like one shitty bathroom and it was dirty and gross, right?
Right. And like the carpet was old and the flooring was old. And none of it mattered because everyone just went there and shot. And like the range had like one light bulb in it. Like you go in and there's a gun shop downstairs, and you nervously interact with the counter staff because you don't really feel like you're supposed to be there. You feel kind of transgressive, but to them it's normal. And they're like, well, who are these weirdos in our shop? And we're just like 21 years old. We've never handled a gun before, never had a lesson or anything. They give us like the real quick, here's how to load it. Don't point it at yourself. Don't point it at me. Have fun. And we're on our own with, I think I had like a 40 caliber Glock the first time I shot a gun.
Of course you did.
Because I went and I'm like, I want to shoot a gun. They're like, here you go. And they just slide the gun across the countertop to you.
I had a really similar experience. So my mom and I took this class. It was like a 4-hour class, like introduction to handguns. And we shot about 10 rounds at the end. And the whole class was, it was an okay class. It was a lot of kind of very stereotypical gun culture sermonizing. And then at the end, we shot our 10 rounds. And we looked at each other and we're like, oh, that was really fun. My mom's looking at me and I'm looking at her and we're like, we should do this again. We decided we were going to go out and buy our own guns. And we really didn't feel qualified. We're like, we don't know what we're doing. What do we even buy? Like, how do we even do this? How do we approach this? We got to the point where we just started going online and researching and learning a little bit. But at first, I remember that feeling similar to what you describe. It's just like this sudden freedom. And you're like, what do I do with this?
Yeah, exactly. People who haven't experienced this imagine this as being kind of like a fetishistic or weird psychological experience where it's like, oh, I felt so powerful, or it was so exciting. I don't think it gets described really well. I think there's a certain kind of excitement, but it mostly has to do with realizing that there is a greater potential than you thought there was.
Right.
There's another door of things that has been opened in your life that's yours to do with what you please. That's such a unique experience because we have so few of those. It's like, you get your driver's license or you graduate high school or I don't know, like, I don't want to draw a direct correlation between these things, but another world of experience has opened up to you that is now on your life's menu?
Yeah, when I shot the first time, I immediately perceived the power of it. But what really intrigued me about it was the skill aspect. So when I approached it at first, I was approaching it just strictly from the standpoint of wanting to improve my skills and my marksmanship and kind of being interested in the sport of shooting. And it wasn't until much later that I turned that into activism.
Yeah, the skill part of it definitely captured me too. Because like people really like doing things that involve accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've been throwing rocks at our prey since we could stand on 2 feet, right? So we're like, oh, this has hand-eye coordination. I am hooked on it completely, right? And you see like a big improvement the first couple times you go and you're like, oh my God, I could get good at this. And it's like more or less accessible to me. And I can get good at this as fast as I can buy ammo, more or less. But at least that's the impression you get as a noob. And then you get sucked into it with the excitement of potentially being a good shot.
Yeah, I had that feeling too, where I was like, I'm actually kind of good at this. Who would have thought? I wonder how far I can take it. And so I started looking online for marksmanship tips. I found some YouTube videos of people doing IDPA, which is International Defensive Pistol. And it's like a speed and action pistol competition. It's a game, but it's based on approximations of real life scenarios. And so I saw people running around and shooting fast and doing all these different techniques. And I thought, ooh, that looks cool. I'm going to try that. I went out and found a person who was kind of like a mentor and a teacher in that field and took my first lesson and met some really cool friends and started getting sucked into that community. And it wasn't until I had been doing that for a while that I actually thought like, oh, I could actually carry this pistol on my person and I could actually use it to protect my own life in a deadly force situation. That came a lot later for me. It had been a while. I don't think I started carrying for months, maybe even a year after I started shooting. It wasn't until I had significant immersion and significant positive experience with gun culture that I even considered that was something I might want to do. When I think back too about what actually made me think about it, it wasn't people sermonizing at me and it wasn't people, telling me I was wrong about anything. It was just the people that lived by example. And when I started to kind of get deeper and deeper into gun culture and I saw that people who study violence have a really specific type of confidence that I admired. And it's kind of like, well, the worst case scenario and you're prepared for it, so you don't have to be afraid. And that's what I found really appealing about it. And especially as a woman, I grew up always being told, you can't go jogging alone, or you can't go out at night, or always make sure you have a buddy. And that kind of stuff, again, as kind of an anti-authoritarian person, that pissed me off.
It's also kind of infantilizing, isn't it?
It really is. It's insulting. And I was like, well, what the hell? You're going to tell me I can't go out after dark? What the fuck is this? I thought, no, that's not gonna fly. The other thing I found about firearms was that learning a little bit about my actual risk, and not just what people had told me to fear, but my actual risk and my actual capabilities and my actual potential in a violent encounter made me just feel more confident, and it was really personally empowering.
So for you, does gun ownership become coherent with liberalism through the lens of female empowerment for you? Is that the primary mechanism there, or is it more than that?
I'd say it's more than that, but that's a really thoughtful question. Personal empowerment is huge, but for me, gun ownership didn't conflict with any of my liberal values in the first place. So it really wasn't that big of a stretch. For me, my values, they're really heavy on, I'm heavy on community, but I'm also heavy on individualism. And I think one of the best things you can do for your community is to be as self-sufficient as possible so that you're not draining resources from it. And it puts you in a position to better help others. So gun ownership was kind of a natural fit there. It's like, if I can provide for my own safety, I'm not relying on an overly oppressive state to provide that for me.
I had a kind of similar experience where, my experience of liberalism had a lot to do with the sort of perpetual and understood conflict between the individual or the minority and the society or the majority, right? And that the liberal values of live and let live were there to protect the minorities from being trampled. I grew up learning about all of the various inquisitions and holocausts and persecutions of countless racial, ethnic, political, and religious minorities, like things like how religious wars in Europe turned into the societies that we have today as we kind of like worked our way through all of that, or, witch hunts or slavery or the Holocaust itself. All the instances and all the lessons of there being like one person or a small group of people like suffering the consequences of standing up to a incorrect or immoral system at the time. And the sort of like you speaking power to the system was a really compelling root liberal value for me. When we look at the rest of the rights that we talk about as being human rights, aren't all of these other rights, at least in part, so I can speak up and stand up and be principled in the face of power and corruption? Should I not be informed and educated in my rights and in history and in current events and be intellectually and like morally formidable? And why would that be the only permissible dimension on which I might be a force to contend with? Why did all of these liberal values instill in me this notion of justice and describe it as like what should be the core value of the soul of our nation? And like, what's a more empowering backstop against like being bullied and coerced into like silence, compliance, or obedience than owning the same equipment that the police or the military might have? Isn't that where you become this most responsible, empowered citizen?
Yeah.
Isn't that like the peak of the self-actualization curve here?
That really ties into my liberal values as well, because one of the core ones there is it's in general a core liberal value that you want the citizen to be as powerful as possible. It's like power to the people, right?
Yeah.
And to me, the Second Amendment is about increasing the power of the individual relative to the power of the state. For me, as a liberal, I don't think of it in terms of stand up and overthrow the government. I don't really think of it that way. I just think of it as righting a power imbalance.
We talk about checks and balances in civics class and how essential those are in maintaining this republic that is supposed to protect the individual. When we talk about checks and balances, the legislative and executive and judicial aren't the only checks and balances. We're part of that equation too.
Yep, absolutely. And so things like peaceful protest, nonviolent demonstrations, civil disobedience, all the way up to armed resistance. And it's something we saw, with the Black Panthers. It's a core value, but it has had different expressions over the years. And for me, I don't see any conflict between believing that and also believing in other core values of community and the concept of individual rights. It all kind of ties together for me.
Look at the history of the 20th century and take the lessons of that as they pertain to the various horrendous and tragic oppressions of individual rights, or like the eradication of entire peoples that occurred in otherwise totally normal countries, and paint a picture that normalcy is tenuous, and that if we care about these values, we should always be vigilant for propaganda and corruption and certain kinds of demagoguery because they're extremely dangerous. Yeah, it's our responsibility to be alert to those things. But you don't really expect me to not own a rifle in a country where it's not just a right, but it's like highly encouraged, in the structure of how things are put together.
Yeah, it does kind of all tie together like that. I see it as not only my right as a citizen, but a part of my duty, like the way I see voting. And everyone expresses this in different ways. So if you don't like guns, don't get one. That's totally fine, and I respect that. But for me, I see it as a little bit of my responsibility to increase my power, like power of the people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. Like we're supposed to be the watchdogs against all the different ways that our society can become illiberal. Mm-hmm. One of those ways is through things like the church or corporations taking too much control of the government and swinging it one way or another.
Yeah, exactly.
And while we've got a number of tools in our toolbox to prevent that, I'm not really interested in taking tools out of that toolbox.
Yeah, I cannot think of a single example where a population has benefited from being less powerful in comparison to the state.
I don't want to open the toolbox and go, oh, you know what, that would have, there's that missing wrench that
Right.
I need for this job.
That would have come in so handy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I don't want that either.
It seems really obvious that this is like compatible with our values.
Yeah, it works great for me. There are a lot of liberal values available to us that we can appeal to without being morally inconsistent. It's pretty easy to do. It's in the way that we present the argument, I think.
Yeah, it's hard because this seems obvious to me.
Yeah,
like, I think about like what makes me a liberal.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that exercising 100% of my rights to their absolute maximum isn't included in that.
Yeah, that's what we do. We'll see how it goes. I hope it helps people. And if it helps people, I hope they share it with people who it will also help.
Yeah. I would really, really like to see people finding a couple solid conversation partners in their life with whom they disagree about most anything, and start using some of the tools and some of the arguments that we put out there to not change their mind, but to help them understand our point of view and not think of us as evil aliens for thinking this. That's
exactly.
If we can make that kind of progress, first of all, that would be amazing considering how polarized politics are.
Yeah.
But if you can get one person not to change their mind, but to remember that you exist as an individual when they think about this issue, and decrease their willingness to actively work against you.
Yeah.
Like when you become the fully materialized human representative of this issue to them.
I'm just going to condense this down to a couple short words. We're going to humanize this issue.
Yeah.
That's
definitely.
What we want to do.
We want
here.
to humanize this issue for the people. Like if you can humanize this issue for a couple people in your life, then they won't vote with malice as much.
Yeah, and that's where you saw a lot of success with the gay rights movement as well. It was kind of a two-pronged approach. So you had people marching down Main Street, you had people getting beat up by the cops, and you had the extreme positions represented, but you also had the coming out movement, and that was huge.
A lot of people.
That was huge. You're sitting around the dinner table, and your relative that you know and you love comes out as gay, and that humanizes the issue for you. It has to. It's personal.
Yeah, the issue has a face, and it's the face of someone you care about and respect.
Yep, and that's what we want to do for this movement as well. I see a lot of action to push each side further apart, but I like to just help remind each other that we are human and we're in this together.
Yeah, the current meme in politics is that the divide is irreparable, and there's an emerging conversation that's kind of got a reluctant, hesitant optimism about whether or not the gulf can be repaired. And I think the only way to repair it is to step into it, not to wonder about whether it can be repaired, not to wonder about exactly how it's going to happen. Just put more people in that gap and then they'll be together.
Yeah, I like that.
And then we'll figure it out once we're there.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening to
Guns Guide to
Liberals. That's probably our geekiest outro yet.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, we're cool with that. We embrace our
This ain't no
geekiness.
casual geekery.
And we're out.
If you've got something really negative to say, you can come find us on Twitter, where we don't have an account.